Listen to part of a lecture in a philosophy class. The professor has been talking about ethics.
Okay, if we're going to discuss goodness and justice, what makes an individual good or a society just or virtuous, then we need to start with the ancient Greeks. So we'll start with Plato, Plato's philosophy. Now, some of you may have studied Plato's philosophy in some other course, so this might be easy. Okay, at the risk of boring you, let me give you just an overview of Plato's ethical theory. Plato says the soul has, and by soul, he simply means that which animates the body, gives it life. Anyway, he says that the soul has three separate parts, called, faculties, which I'll come back to. He believed that goodness in an individual was to be found when the three parts of the soul worked together, when they weren't in conflict but existed in harmony. A good or just person will have a soul in which the three faculties work well together. So how does he arrive at that analysis? Well, he starts out in his very famous work, The Republic. He starts out by saying it's very difficult to get a grasp on what the individual soul looks like. So, to get some idea of what the individual human soul is like, he says we should study the structure of society, what kinds of people and activities every society has to have. He argues that every society has to have three groups of people, workers, soldiers, and leaders, and each has a sort of defining characteristic. Every society has to have workers, like farmers, or people who work in factories, producing all the things that we need for everyday life. And according to Plato, the key feature of workers is that they're focused on their own desires or appetites, interested in satisfying the needs of the body. So workers are associated with desire. Okay? Now, if you live in a society that has a good amount of wealth, good agriculture, good industry, other societies are probably going to try to take it. So you need a class of soldiers who are supposed to protect the state from external threats. Well, these soldiers, they're going to be in dangerous situations quite frequently, so you need people with a lot of high spirit, an emotional type of individual. Emotion is what characterizes this group. And then, Plato says, the third group you need is leaders. Their main role will be to think rationally, to use their reason or intellect to make decisions. As decision-makers, leaders determine what the state is to do, how the affairs of the citizens are to be run. Plato then asks himself, okay, assume we've got such a society with these three groups. When will this society be a good, a just society? Well, you can only have a good society when its three parts are working well together, each doing its proper thing. And Plato believes this can only happen if workers and soldiers learn moderation or self-control. But why? Why do workers and soldiers have to learn self-control? Well, how can a society flourish if the workers and soldiers don't control their desires and emotions? Plato thinks that if they aren't under control, workers will sleep too much and play too much, so they're not going to get their jobs done. And soldiers need to channel their high-spiritedness in a certain direction, precisely by being courageous. But you're not going to get that automatically. You need to teach them this kind of moderation. So you need an educational system that, first of all, will train the leaders so that they'll make good decisions, so they'll know what's wise. Then make leaders responsible. Turn over to them the education of the other two groups. And through education, build a society so that the workers and soldiers learn to use their intellect to control their desires and emotions. If you had all that, then, for Plato, you'd have a good or just society. Now take that picture, that social, political picture, and apply it to the individual person. You remember about the soul? That it consists of three separate parts or faculties? Can you guess what they are? Desires, emotions, and intellect. The characteristics associated with the three groups of society. And can you guess how Plato defines a good or just person? Well, it's parallel to how he characterizes a good or just society. The three parts have to be in harmony. In each of us, our desires and emotions often get the better of us and lead us to do foolish things. They're in conflict with the intellect. So to get them to all work together, to coexist in harmony, every person needs to be shaped in the same way that we've shaped society, through the educational system. Individuals must be educated to use their intellect to control their emotions and desires. That's harmony in the soul.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Now, some of you may have studied Plato's philosophy in some other course, so this might be easy. Okay, at the risk of boring you, let me give you just an overview of Plato's ethical theory.
What does the professor imply about Plato's ethical theory? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
But why? Why do workers and soldiers have to learn self-control? Well, how can a society flourish if the workers and soldiers don't control their desires and emotions?
Why does the professor ask this?
Well, how can a society flourish if the workers and soldiers don't control their desires and emotions?
Listen to part of a talk in a botany class.
Okay, so we've talked about some different types of root systems of plants, and I've shown you some pretty cool slides, but now I want to talk about the extent of the root system, the overall size of the root system, the depth. I want to tell you about one particular experiment. I think you're going to find this pretty amazing. Okay, so there was this scientist. This very meticulous scientist decided that the best place to see a whole root system, to actually see how big the entire system got, the best place would be to grow it where?
Water?
In water. So he took rye plants, it was rye plants, and he started growing them in water. Now, you've all heard of growing stuff in water before, right?
It's done commercially, right? Like to grow vegetables and flowers?
Right. They grow all kinds of commercial crops in water. So, if you're growing things in water, you can add the fertilizer. What do you need to do to that water besides put fertilizer in it? Anyone ever actually tried to grow plants in water? You must bubble water through it. Bubble gas through it. You must bubble gas through it. So, gas, you have to bubble through. Think about the soil we talked about last week, about growing plants in soil. Think about some of you who have killed your favorite houseplants because you love them too much. If you overwater, why do your favorite houseplants die?
Oh, no oxygen.
Not enough oxygen for the roots, which do what 24 hours a day in all seasons?
Respiration?
Respire, respiration. They breathe. So if you just stick rye plants in water, it doesn't make a difference how much fertilizer you add. You also need to bubble gas through the water. So they have access to that oxygen. If they don't have that, they're in big trouble. Okay, so this scientist, grew a rye plant in water so he could see the root system, how big it got, its surface area. I read about this, and the book said 1,000 kilometers of roots. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. It just doesn't make any sense to me that could be right, but that's what all the books have, and no one's ever corrected it. So let me explain to you about this rye plant. If you take a little seed of many grasses, and remember, rye is a grass. If you take a tiny little seed and you germinate it, actually, take one of my least favorite grasses that starts growing about May. What's my least favorite grass that starts growing about May?
Crabgrass.
Crabgrass. Remember how I showed you in the lab, one little seed starts out producing one little shoot, then at a week or so later, you've got about 6 shoots. And then 3 weeks later, you've got about 15 shoots coming out all directions, like this. All those little shoots up there? Well, that's what they did with the rye. And the little seedlings started, and pretty soon there were several shoots, and then more shoots. In the end, that one single seed produced 80 shoots, with an average of 50 centimeters of height from one seed. 80 shoots coming out. Average 50 centimeters high. When they looked at the shoot versus the root surface, they found that the shoot surface, with all of its leaves, had a total surface area of about 5 square meters. Now, here's the biggie. When they looked at the root surface area, you would expect that the root and the shoot would be in balance, right? So they should be pretty close in terms of surface area, right? What's that? Did somebody say no? Well, you're absolutely correct. Instead of 5 square meters, the root system was found to have more than 200 square meters of surface area. Where did all of that extra surface area come from? Who did it? Who was responsible for all those extra square meters of surface area? What did roots do to increase their surface area?
Root hairs.
Root hairs, that's exactly it. So those root hairs were responsible for an incredible chunk of surface area. They constantly have to be spread out in the water so they can absorb minerals from the fertilizer. And of course, they need oxygen access as well.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
What do you need to do to that water besides put fertilizer in it? Anyone ever actually tried to grow plants in water? You must bubble water through it. Bubble gas through it. You must bubble gas through it. So, gas, you have to bubble through.
Why did the professor say this?
You must bubble gas through it.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I read about this, and the book said 1,000 kilometers of roots. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. It just doesn't make any sense to me that could be right, but that's what all the books have, and no one's ever corrected it. So let me explain to you about this rye plant.
What does the professor intend to explain? Listen to part of a lecture in a business management class.
Okay, let's talk about organization and structure in a company. How are companies typically structured?
Functionally.
And?
By projects.
Right, by function and by projects. 20 years ago, companies were organized in function groups, where people with a certain expertise worked together as a unit. The architects in one unit, the finance people in another unit. Well, nowadays, a lot of companies are organized around projects. Like a construction company could be building an office building in one city and an apartment house somewhere else, and each project has its own architects and engineers. Now, the good thing about project organization is that it's easier to change to adapt to the needs of the project. It's a small group, a dedicated team, not the whole company. Now, with that in mind, here's a question for you. Why do we continue to organize ourselves by function, even now, when in fact we admit that projects are the lifeblood of a lot of organizations? Why do some companies maintain a functional organization instead of organizing around projects? Yes?
Because if you don't have that functional structure within your organization, chances are you'd have a harder time meeting the goals of the projects.
Why?
Why?
Listen, let's say we got 4 new cars we want to design. Why do we need a functional organization? Why not just organize the company around the 4 projects? These people make car number 1, these other people make car number 2.
Yeah, but who's going to be responsible for what? You know, the way you tell who's...
Well, we'll appoint a manager. New car number 1 manager, car number 2 manager. They're completely responsible. Why should we have a single engineering department that has all 4 cars passing through it?
When you design a car, you need the expertise of all the engineers in the company. Each engineer needs to be in touch with the entire engineering department.
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why. Yes.
Well, to eliminate redundancy is probably one of the biggest factors in an organization, so that there's standards for uniformity and efficiency in the organization.
Okay, and that's probably the primary reason for functional organization right there, is that we want some engineering consistency. We want the same kind of technology used in all 4 cars. If we disperse those 4 engineers into 4 parts of the organization and they work by themselves, there's a lot less chance that the technology's going to be the same from car to car. So instead, we maintain the functional organization. That means the engineers work together in one part of the building. and their offices are next to each other because we want them to talk to each other. When an engineer works on a project, they bring the expertise of their whole functional group with them. But there's a downside of that, though, isn't there? I mean, organizing a company into functional groups is not all positive. Where's the allegiance of those engineers? It's to their coordinator, right? It's to that chief engineer. But we really want our one engineer, the engineer that's working on car number 1, we want that person's loyalty to be to that project as well as to the head of the engineering group. We really want both, don't we? We want to maintain the functional organization so we can maintain uniformity and technology transfer and expertise. We want the cutting-edge expertise in every group. But at the same time, we also want the engineer to be totally dedicated to the needs of the project. Ideally, we have a hybrid, a combination of both functional and project organization. But there's a problem with this kind of hybrid structure. When you have both functional and project organization, well, what does that violate in terms of basic management principles?
Unity of command.
Unity of command. That's exactly right. So this is a vicious violation of unity of command, isn't it? It says that this engineer working on a project seems to have two bosses. We got the engineering boss and we got the project manager boss. But the project manager is responsible for the project and is not the official manager of the engineer who works on the project. And we try to maintain peace in the organizations, and sometimes it's disrupted and we have conflicts, don't we? The project manager for car 1 wants a car part to fit in a particular way for a specific situation, a specialized case. Well, the engineering director says, no, we got to have standardization. We got to have all the cars done this way. We can't make a special mold for that particular part for that particular car. We're not going to do that. So we got a conflict.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Why should we have a single engineering department that has all 4 cars passing through it?
When you design a car, you need the expertise of all the engineers in the company. Each engineer needs to be in touch with the entire engineering department.
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why.
Why does the professor say this?
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why.